Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and our Facebook page through a YouTube link. So it's been a week. So how are you doing, Sydney?
I am doing. I think it's a week of holding my breath, really, honestly. Same for you, right? Like, it's just been a lot.
Everyone, right? Like, this has just been a lot to process for everybody, everyone, everywhere. Even like my friend in Australia texted me, like, how are you doing? Because it's just been a lot.
Wow. Right? Because, and I think that's why I wanted to like do this little check-in at the beginning, because what purpose are we serving if we don't talk about it, right? Like, it's been this weird, odd, historical week of this election, and I think no matter what side you're on, what outcome you were hoping for or bracing for or preparing for or whatever it might be, like, life has been hanging in the balance for a long time, and by the time this comes out, for a week almost, and it's been a lot. So that people found ways to take care, they've found ways to find support and get connected to resources if you needed them, or take a break from social media or the news or whatever it might be. And because of that, how heavy it's all been, we wanted to do what we could to kind of talk about a lighter topic this week. It's not super light, but like it's lighter. So
light for us, like our version of light is, still talking about domestic and sexual violence, just not as heavy, I guess.
Right. I guess we're going to talk about, TV and movies and maybe some music, and that's light, but we're going to talk about, sexual violence in those TVs and movies and things.
It's normal for us, not probably normal for most people, but it is normal in the sense that people watch movies and TV shows all the time. And I think we were talking about this earlier, how like we can't escape it. Like I love how you were saying, like, it's almost like a game to try to find something that doesn't have some type of, domestic or sexual violence in it. Like I would tell you about this all the time of how, I'm tired after work. I don't always want to like watch movies that have scenes that are heavy, like related to our work. And so I found the only safe shows really are like cooking shows, because you're not going to have domestic violence or sexual assault like pop up in cooking shows. But everything else is kind of like, you never know what you're watching, and all of a sudden there'll be a scene and you're like, oh, right.
Exactly. I think we were talking about how like this is lighter for us, but it's still part of our everyday conversations. And I think people notice it probably more than they think they do when sexual violence or domestic violence pops up in TVs or movies. It gives you that like weird like little twinge of like, oh, that seemed a little interesting, or that seemed odd. But for me, when I'm watching TV, my work is still always at the forefront of my mind, especially at the end of the day, right? I haven't totally decompressed yet. If I turn on the TV and I see something, I'm like, oh my God, that was assault. Like my family members are like, really? Come on. And I'm like, what do you mean, really? Come on. Like, it's right
like,
there.
We have to call it out. Like, it's happening. It's so true.
And so it's interesting the ways that it pops up, but I do think that this is kind of a lighter topic, but one that people can relate to, right? Where we're not talking about something super heavy or like pressing, or it just kind of is what it is if they're showing up in movies and TVs today or 20 years ago.
Exactly.
And it is what it doesn't matter, but like those movies and TVs are already out. Like it's already happened.
Right. And it's bringing attention to the thing that we're all noticing in some way or another, which is why it's funny, like when we were talking about doing this episode, we were having so much trouble coming up with like more recent ones. And we thought it was partly because there are some more movies and TV shows that are being like more cognizant of, the language they use or the characters, having more diversity, inclusivity, and acceptance. Like, we're seeing less, I think, like blatant sexism or blatant racism, like in more of the newer TV shows and movies, because we're holding networks accountable for the things they've done for the however many past decades that were never okay to have in movies and TV shows. There are obviously still a lot of movies and TV shows that have blatant racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. But we're seeing less of it, which is a great thing because people are calling it out and like not tolerating it or not supporting, I'm going to not watch that TV show because of the way they depicted like trans people or whatever it might be. So we're seeing better messaging and better, like, I guess, depictions of these things, but there's still an issue that's very obvious.
Definitely. I just had a thought when you were saying like we're holding networks and people like that accountable. A couple of years ago, within the last like 5 years or something, the actresses from One Tree Hill wrote that letter. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
About their show, saying like how unsafe and abusive the like set was because he was just incredibly like harassing. Like there was sexual harassment all the time. They were forced to do things they didn't want to do, whether it was in scenes or like he just made them uncomfortable. And the letter spoke to like how afraid they were to kind of object to what was going on because they didn't want to lose their job and they liked the show and all that stuff. So even the actors in these projects, movies, TVs, whatever, are also holding people accountable, coming forward as survivors and things like that, which is not easy to do at all. But I think that all across the board, like consumers or people who are watching this and also people who are doing it are refusing to. Yeah, exactly, which I think is all about accountability, or what accountability is all about. So I think that's cool.
So I know we made a list earlier of movies and TV shows. We were trying to come up with ones that we remembered kind of watching growing up, or not even just younger, but like within the past decade or so. So I'm just gonna, how about read them all out and then we can kind of pick and choose which ones we want to highlight. So we came up with American Pie, Bring It On, Wedding Crashers, the TV show You, TV show Big Little Lies, 13 Reasons Why, Friends, Scrubs, Game of Thrones, Mad Men, Vampire Diaries, Shameless, Handmaid's Tale, and a bajillion others. Those are just some of the ones that we came up with that had problematic themes. So we talked about how there's a difference in like some of those shows had problematic themes of homophobia or sexism or racism or like things of that nature, and then some of them had really harmful depictions of rape or sexual violence or domestic violence, or used their movie to like make fun of these things instead of highlighting them and things like that. So there's a difference in obviously like Game of Thrones and Friends, right? Like a lot of things that are different. But are there any in particular that stand out to you in that list that you want to start with?
I think the one that, just based on the thing that's popping up in my mind, is Shameless, because of how like overt some of it is, right? Mm-hmm. Like not necessarily that they were always making fun of it, but the number of times that I saw in watching this season, like sexual assault on screen, like happening, right, was a lot. And I brought it up to someone that I knew had also watched it. And I was like, I feel like every episode I'm like, oh, there's another one. Oh, there's another one and another one and another one. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, there's this character does this and this one that does that and here and there. And she was like, oh my gosh, you're right. And I, because it's not necessarily like I was kind of saying before, the stranger in the alleyway that grabs the person,
right,
and assaults them, it's not as glaringly obvious. But when looking at it from the lens of like, was consent present or like what's happening,
right,
shame was like everywhere with so many of these different problematic themes, from sexism to, racism and all of that stuff. But just in the lens of sexual violence, like that was multiple times a season, I would be like, oh God, oh no, again.
Yeah.
Domestic violence, physical violence in relationships and things like that too, that is just like never even talked about. And so it's would be hard for me to make it through so many seasons. Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because I was thinking like, I haven't seen Shameless, so it's fun to bring different perspectives because I haven't seen that one. But, and I know you don't really watch Game of Thrones, right? Or haven't seen it. So, because that was the one that stuck out to me that I was thinking about. Yeah, that there are some articles that I was reading about like the use of sexual violence as a part of a plot. And even I think, is it Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? Like, I haven't read those books or seen those movies either, but the same thing of like, there's a lot of research being done about like what it means to make rape, particularly like a part of the female character's narrative. And almost like they have to use it as a way for that character to have like purpose, you know, like I'm getting revenge, or it's driving my, you know, like motivation to do something or whatever, and how problematic that can be. And like for Game of Thrones fans, like the ones, I mean, there's so much sexual violence in that show, but the one scene that stuck out to me was when Sansa was raped, and it was like you were watching the scene play out, and it was so like visceral and real and raw, because you're literally not, it's not like it was implied, right? Or like you kind of knew it was going to happen and then the camera goes away. Like you were watching it, and it felt so unnecessary. Like you already knew how evil this character was. Like he was an evil character, but they needed, for some reason, whatever they decided, the writers decided to use the rape to like further depict how evil he was. And it just wasn't, and there's some, at least people, kind of journalists and whatever, talking about like, is it necessary to like show this kind of violence? And it's an interesting question, because I mean, there's a lot of the movies we listed here where they depict it in other ways. Like we were just talking about Wedding Crashers, where it's depicted in a humorous way, which is also really wrong. So it's like, there's, you know, it's interesting just to see how it's depicted.
I never thought about that before, like what you're saying, those like journalists are like researching and things like that, because it's so true. Like it is, for any survivor, a moment in time in their life that will create something, right? Good, bad, change, growth, who knows, right? Like it kind of depends on where you're at. But I never thought about it in that way of like, we're putting it in here because this is the way we can show like a female character changing or developing or growing or something like that. And maybe, oh God, I don't even like that I'm going to say this, but like maybe sometimes it has its place, because I think it's important to talk about it and call it out and say like,
sure, yeah,
survivor's experience and what life really can look like. But never when it's being made fun of, like really what we were talking about earlier about the Wedding Crashers scene, like that's wild to me.
Yeah, and I mean, I was even thinking, I haven't seen the movie Ted, but I think like a lot of like prison rape jokes, right? Like just making fun of male victims of sexual violence, totally not even acknowledging like the LGBTQ community, definitely not acknowledging like the Black community or people of color who are victims, because of all the stereotypes. And that's why like we talk about how like racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, they all intersect and play a role. And ableism, yeah, like how they all play a role in like allowing sexual violence and domestic violence to thrive. They're all connected in some way. And so I think about like all the like jokes about, you know, like homophobic jokes or transphobic jokes, and even like in Friends, like I think about the jokes they made about the Manny, right, the male nanny, like how his son was playing with a Barbie doll, and they were like, oh my God, you know, and just a lot of sexism, like even if it was like kind of discreet or like not as blatant, like it wasn't like a rape scene, right? But they all contribute to our attitudes about sexuality or gender identity or gender roles and norms. So
you know what I think about all the time is the like pyramid, like of like rape culture and stuff like that. Like I swear, like once I started my work at the Women's Center, that's just how like that's the lens in which I view the world. And it's helped teach me a lot. It's helped open my eyes to a ton of things. I also think sometimes it is frustrating to like have to always think from that perspective, because I can't watch a TV show and hear, oh, stop throwing like a girl, without being like, oh my gosh, you know, like
contributing to sexual violence, right?
Yes.
So true.
The ways that it can be built into shows, right, or music or books or movies or whatever is sometimes super, super obvious, and we can notice it right away, but it's also really important to call out, you know, the language in shows and things like that. I'm trying to think of what else on that list. I was mentioning earlier when I recently started watching Scrubs, right? And it was filmed 20 years ago or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And the jokes and the sexism and the sexual harassment and the smacking each other on the butt and like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the female doctor is like she's less than or whatever. Like it's wild how okay it was at that point in time, and like that would never fly now if they tried to film it, and that's okay. Learning, they're changing. I think
Right.
they just released like a podcast now where they're talking about what it was like filming the show. Like the
Huh.
actors today are talking about what it was like, and I guess they call it out, like they call attention to it. They're like, we noticed that these jokes were written in a very different time.
Well, and it's like funny because I think people are like angry that like, oh, we can't say anything without it being offensive or whatever, and getting like angry about that. But it's like, no, these behaviors were never okay. It's just that now we're actually holding people and networks and whatever accountable for that. But we're still seeing it where, like, I know we were talking about this earlier. I haven't seen the show You because I was like, I know what it's going to be about, and I don't want to watch this guy. I'd rather watch my cooking shows or whatever. But that's a perfect example of how we're still seeing these behaviors show up in movies and TV shows today, like in now, you know, current times. And even though some of them are trying to highlight how bad they are, they're using, I know the actor who portrayed that character of the, you know, the stalker and whatever, came out to say like, stop glorifying my character. Like, let's not get it confused with like, thank you for thinking I'm attractive. But like, just because I'm attractive in your eyes, like, doesn't mean that my stalking or like harassment or like totally inappropriate and dangerous behavior can be dismissed or minimized, like, because this happens in real life. And I thought that was really cool that he was able to say like, don't glorify this, like this is bad. I thought that was great.
I was thinking that too when you brought up You. I started to think about that fact of like, maybe like what you're saying, these behaviors were never okay. People now love to be like, oh, everybody's so triggered or so offended all the time, but like a survivor watching that 20 years ago wasn't happy with it, you know, but now maybe it's the Me Too movement, maybe it is, you know, just the changing culture that is happening across the world. Like, we're giving space to people to talk about this stuff, which is awesome. And 20 years ago, you know, the actors in the show portraying the stalker or the abuser or whatever weren't necessarily saying, this isn't okay. Like, I'm playing a character and like, it's important that we know that his behaviors aren't okay. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. When Penn Badgley, I think is who it is, released that kind of opinion about his character, I was like, good for him, like calling that out. That's really takes some strength to be able to do that, for fear of like losing viewers or who knows what. But I think like we could definitely talk about this stuff forever and ever, and I'm sure we'll do, you know, a continued conversation on it, because I want to talk about like music and what it's like to hear it in lyrics and things like that. But really, like, I don't know, do you have any other thoughts on kind of what we've talked about today? Are there any things that we didn't touch on?
No, I think my closing thought maybe is that it's okay to call it out when you see it, when you're watching, because, you know, we are still seeing it today. And obviously there are a lot of great shows now, newer shows that are trying to kind of combat those things. And like I think we mentioned earlier, there are comedians who are able to talk about the issues without making fun of the issues. Like, there's a way to integrate it into humor. There's a way to integrate it into entertainment without taking away people's valid and real experiences, and having these real conversations. So don't shy away from those conversations if you're seeing it in a show, and don't be afraid to not watch a show. I do it all the time where I'm like starting to watch something and I'm like, nope, this has domestic violence in it, I'm out. Big Little Lies I wanted to watch because I was in it, but there are other like You that I was like, nah, I'm good. So it's okay to kind of participate or not if you're feeling like you don't want to be, you know, in that or whatever.
And do a gut check, right? Of like, I can sit and tolerate this one, but I can't tolerate that one. And that's okay. You're entitled to that. You know, if the way to get through the show or the movie is by acknowledging when consent wasn't present, or like, oh, hey, that's a great job. That's one of my favorite things to do. When I see consent happen or take place in something, I will sit there and be like, yes, go, this is
or like
great.
that
And
was
like
a healthy
have a moment
relationship.
to
Like, look at how they resolved that conflict. That was so healthy. Yeah, like pointing out the good things and the bad things. Yeah, totally.
because it is there. Like it is there. You know, we were talking about Frozen earlier, right? When that like example at the end of the movie when they ask about consent, and like it's fun to notice it and to talk about it. It makes me feel good. It's exciting, and it's just important to look at the good stuff too. I think.
Totally.
So I kind of feel like that kind of wraps up our conversation for today. I'm glad we talked about it. I do want to talk more about this stuff. But jumping back to what we talked about at the beginning, you know, hang in there. We are here for people for any reason if you need support for anything. The rest of the month, there's a ton of opportunities that WCSU is doing for students to provide election support to anyone kind of on either side, no matter what's going on. You can check out Instagram. I think there's information on a bunch of different platforms about that. Also, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, feedback for us today about anything or about this topic, feel free to email us. You can call us. And also, obviously, you'll be able to watch these videos on Instagram, Facebook, through a YouTube link, and it will be released every Tuesday at 5. But thank you so much for joining us, and share it with a friend, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone.